It was a desperately dry season in Botswana, so much so that thousands of people from as far as South Africa came to this stadium to plead on behalf of their neighbors for help.
We're here to pray for rain.
In this part of Africa, rain means money. The name of Botswana's currency, the pula, means rain. And here, in this nation of cattle herders who need fresh grass for their animals, rain means everything.
It's cultural. In the past, because of our arid climate, because of poor soils, the only form of agriculture that could be undertaken successfully was cattle rearing. There were no jobs, very few jobs, no minerals, and so a man was judged by the number of animals that he has.
In a country of 1.7 million people, a quarter of Botswana's households rely in some way on cattle for their livelihood, so drought can bring disaster. But cattle producers recently faced an even greater threat than that. The state-run Botswana Meat Commission, the BMC, has a monopoly on all cattle exports, which must all be processed through a BMC-run abattoir. And they weren't paying producers enough money for their cattle to cover their costs. The result? A crisis that threatened the entire industry.
Prices at the BMC are so low that producing cattle in Botswana has become uneconomic.
Everything changed when Philip Fisher decided to get together with his fellow cattle farmers and do something about the low prices. They formed the Botswana Cattle Producers Association, and immediately the BCPA tried to get the BMC and the government to do something about their difficult plight.
Interestingly enough, getting the farmers together was not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge was initially engaging with government.
What follows is an incredible story and possible success for Southern Africa. It's a textbook example of how the private sector united to speak out and convince the government to change its policy for the better.
There has to be a very clear reason why people are going to get together and spend time on an issue. In Botswana, if you're in the cattle production industry, it's survival.
In 2005, Botswana's cattle industry was in serious decline. At this cattle auction in Gaborone, drought and depressed prices were a lethal combination for producers.
So you don't necessarily have to buy, but if you're a potential buyer, please register and get yourself a buyer's card.
But the cattle industry, through the BCPA, had already begun to engage the government in discussions.
The weatherman is saying that rain is imminent.
The group of farmers knew they needed outside help, so they contacted USAID's Southern Africa Trade Hub, set up under the U.S. President's trade initiative for sub-Saharan Africa.
I think we really played a pretty unique cooperative role here. We were working with them from an institutional development side, supporting meetings, giving them a voice, doing the observational tour, helping them become legally registered in order to gain recognition from government, doing the analytical think piece, giving them the ammunition and the material that they needed to argue the position, and to do it from an unbiased, neutral perspective.
The Hub also assisted the BCPA in organizing a policy conference that brought government and the private sector together to discuss the issues.
This was the first opportunity for really serious dialogue between the association and the government. It was facilitated by our commercial hub, and it was an opportunity for me as the U.S. ambassador to set the tone for the meetings, to put in some parameters and some things for them to think about, particularly in the area of public-private sector cooperation and coordination.
And the beautiful thing about Botswana is everybody owns cattle. At the beginning of that policy conference, we asked everyone in the room who owns cattle or whose family owned cattle to stand up, and everybody in the room stood up, including the assistant minister.
If I can get my way, I will get this one.
Ministry of Agriculture Permanent Secretary Matthias Chakalisa attended that meeting, and he also showed up at Fisher's auction, hoping to add to his herd of cattle.
And we welcome the formation of associations because it helps us when farmers speak with one voice.
Farmers and government were hardly speaking to each other 12 months before, and yet both were looking at the serious consequences of an economic crisis in the cattle industry. So one of the first orders of business for the newly created BCPA was to open the dialogue with government by presenting some hard facts. The USAID Trade Hub asked Keith Jeffress to do a study that would help the BCPA to make its case. He's the former deputy governor of the Bank of Botswana and now a respected economic consultant.
Although BMC does quite well in selling meat into high-price markets, particularly in Europe, they're a very high-cost structure organisation. So by the time the revenues come from Europe or their other sales, and they deduct whatever it costs them to run an abattoir and market and everything, the amount that's left for the farmers is too low. So the reason for the low prices is essentially that BMC is an inefficient organisation. And it's a monopoly, it's owned by the government, so it's sort of doing what you expect state-owned monopolies to do.
Straight talk like that from the private sector made the BMC look hard at the situation and listen to the BCPA.
If they had been formed 5 years before, we would not be in a situation where we are right now, because they have helped move the beef sector forward. The biggest problem in the past was that either government or quasi-government organizations like the Botswana Meat Commission did not know who to talk to. There was no spokesperson for the farmers. And we tended, as government or quasi-government organization, to make decisions which we thought were helping the farmer, when sometimes they're actually doing the opposite, because there's nobody to talk to.
We've been told by government that our input over the last 6 months has been the most valuable input they've ever had.
There had been 14 regional farmers associations, but farmers didn't have an effective voice until the creation of the BCPA, which brought together the chairman of the regional associations. Loftus Nzingi's family has owned cattle for centuries. He's chairman of one of the regional farmers associations, and he's noticed a big change since he decided to join the BCPA.
I think there has been tremendous progress in this. Firstly, we are now talking with one voice to the government, with the government. And secondly, I think it is very important that at least the stakeholders, the farmers and the government, they should always interact.
I think it was absolutely crucial, and it amazed me that there hadn't been such an organisation before.
In Southern Africa, the private sector has traditionally played a small role in influencing government policy.
In our region and in Botswana, government is stronger than the private sector. Stronger in the sense that you'll have more employees, you'll have, and to some extent, the best brains used to be working for government. And government, so to speak, controls the economy. In the private sector, there'll be very, very few people in the private sector. There'll be little money in the private sector, and that would hamper their getting together to have lobby groups and take the private sector issues forward.
In most of the countries in Southern Africa, the government has so much input into the economy. In many places, it's by far the largest employer. It is the one that stimulates the economy itself and not the private sector. So they've just gone along themselves without consulting the private sector to see how whatever laws, regulations they make would improve the ability of individual industries in the private sector to succeed.
Still, establishing dialogue with government not used to talking to the private sector takes some organized effort and sensitivity.
Get yourself organized, get yourself a voice, do your homework, figure out what the issues are, speak sensibly, speak as a single unified voice. And that's really probably the best way to engage in some sort of a policy dialogue to benefit your sector.
My advice would be to do it, and to do it in as professional a way as possible, to bring in NGOs who are willing to support you, and to keep the dialogue not on a hostile level, but on a level of constructive engagement. And bit by bit, you're able to share ideas, and the ideas lead to policy change, and hopefully the policy change leads to a more conducive environment.
In modern Botswana, the cattle industry is still the country's second largest industry, and it's still crucial to those citizens who live in rural areas, which gave producers and the government a pressing reason to sit down and come up with a solution.
The livelihood of most of the rural people who is basically cattle. If you kill the cattle industry, the rural economy is dead.
The rural areas are generally quite poor. Incomes are low, there's a lot of poverty. And so in terms of generating incomes and economic activities that can have an impact on poverty, the cattle sector is probably the most important single industry that can do that on a nationwide basis.
So the BCPA offered a tough bottom line solution to the government. First, it had to raise prices so they're on par with what the rest of the producers in the region are earning. The government listened. Less than a year after the formation of the BCPA, Cabinet issued a directive to implement export parity pricing. And the BMC announced an interim hike in prices with a view to export parity in the near future.
It was a triumph of the work of a group of very dedicated people who believed in what they were doing, and I've got to give credit to government as well. To be frank with you, that gave us the encouragement to continue the work that we're doing.
Which includes achieving implementation of full export parity and lobbying for the privatization of the BMC, putting control in the hands of farmers. Will the Botswana government be willing to give up its monopoly?
The only thing that needs to be taken a step further is to have the board and the CEO appointed by the farmers. And that would now have BMC working as a cooperative for the farmers and run by the farmers. I'm all for that. But it is also government's policy to privatize. And BMC is within the privatization master plan. And one thinks and hopes that when that happens, BMC then will be run by farmers for the farmers.
It's a stunning admission. The head of a government organization essentially putting himself out of a job.
So I have to say, I'm also a farmer. So when I leave my BMC job, I'm going to go into farming and be active within the BCPA.
They have a number of other things that need to be done to completely open up the market, but this is certainly a step in the right direction.
Which means we can now speak with one voice to government.
With help from the USAID Trade Hub, Philip Fisher and the BCPA are slowly making progress towards the survival of their industry. But they must still struggle to ensure that the government implements those new policies.
They're not used to being held accountable to the private sector. But if it's done in an open, honest, respectful way, I think over time it will work.
We are really, really better off. The information that we have about the industry and about how we should go forward is huge.
Just as the BCPA was finally receiving some of what it had asked for, Botswana's drought came to an end, answering everyone's prayers.